Good evening. My name is Volker Debkat. I'm a trained historian and professor of American Studies at the University of Regensburg. And I also have the honor of serving on the board of directors of the Bavarian American Academy, and it is in this capacity that I welcome you all to tonight's event, 9/11, 20 years after. It's great that so many people found their way into the newly redecorated Theatersaal, resisting the temptations of summer, but also a warm welcome to everybody on the YouTube screens all around the world. A special welcome goes to Consul General Timothy Liston, who has just started his 3-year term here as Consul General in Munich, and is making one of his first public appearances, and we here at the Amerikahaus and the Bavarian American Academy feel very honored that you found your way into these halls and that you join us for tonight's event. The Bavarian American Academy is operating under the roof of the Amerikahaus Foundation. It is the academic arm, if you so wish, of this foundation. We are a network organization that joins scholars teaching things American at Bavaria's universities from multiple disciplines to further the study of the United States and North America here in Bavaria. And as such, we do a lot of somehow support. We dish out a lot of support for young scholars writing their dissertations through numerous scholarships, stipends, and other forms of grants. We organize lectures. We invite scholars from the United States to give talks at Bavarian universities. We organize annual conferences, and we also organize smaller events like this one here, although this is not really that small. It has grown a lot bigger in the course of events and time. So that's what we do at the Bavarian American Academy, and as such, we also thought that it is a must to commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and this is what we are all here for. So you, again, resisted the temptations of summer to go for an educational experience, and I can promise you that we do our best to fulfill your hopes. Before I hand over to several welcome remarks, a technical information. So you have to wear masks when you move around, but when you sit at your place, you are welcome to take your masks off. Later on, when we have the Q&A, we ask you to stay at your seat and try to speak as loud as you can if you have a question. So much from my side until now. And now it is time for the first welcome remark brought to you by Florian Herrmann, who is the state minister at the Bavarian State Chancellery, and as such, he is the Lord of the Manor, if you so wish, because the Bavarian American Academy and the Amerikahaus are organizations that are funded by the Bavarian state, and we are very thankful for that, because this is one of the few, or the last, of the former Amerikahäuser that is still operating as an Amerikahaus, and this thanks to generous funding by the Bavarian state. So, Florian Herrmann.
Ladies and gentlemen, the attacks of September 11, 2001 marked a day of bewilderment. In the face of those barbaric and gruesome acts, the whole world held its breath. Billions of people can still remember exactly what they were doing at that very moment. The appalling pictures from New York and Washington have left a feeling of deep sorrow. That day has become engraved on our collective memory because none of us would ever have believed such an atrocity possible. Particularly the survivors and the bereaved are still deeply affected by that fateful day, even 2 decades on. It is our duty toward them and the victims to ensure that remembrance and commemoration are kept alive. It is moving to hear the names of the 2,791 persons who were killed on that day being read out each year in New York. People who had just started their workday in the Twin Towers or who were on those planes were swept to their death from one moment to the next. With these horrifying images in mind, my words are, today is a day to commemorate the many victims. Our thoughts also go out to the survivors, to their families, and to those bereaved, and we all know the pain will never go. Our deepest feelings are with you. These despicable acts, however, were also an attack on the symbols and political and economic power. They amounted to a declaration of war on the liberal and democratic world and were aimed to divide people and fan the flames of hatred. 20 years after the attack, we can say Al-Qaeda was not successful. The Freedom Tower, that reaches 1,776 feet in height and stands on ground zero today, is reminiscent of the Declaration of Independence. It brings across the strong message that the world of freedom and democracy is going to live on. As before, we stand in solidarity with the American people and with all who have fallen victim to that inhumane doctrine. The shocking events in Afghanistan are an urgent warning to us. They make it clear that we must keep on fighting for the values of our modern society. To defend these values, we first and foremost need to do preventive work. Seeking dialogue and taking a clear position in international bodies. Above all, however, it is important that we should not allow ourselves to be intimidated. Even though other challenges, such as the climate crisis or COVID-19, are demanding our attention, 9/11 calls on us to stand up and relentlessly fight for freedom, democracy, and human rights in the future as well.
Okay, thank you, Florian Herrmann, for this welcoming remark. And now I hand over to Timothy Liston, who will be here in real life talking to us.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight to mark 20th anniversary of what I think Dr. Herrmann completely incorrectly called a heinous and gruesome attack, not only in the United States of America, but on the international order and on innocent civilians from 90 countries. Dear Professor Professors Powell and Depka, dear Professors Dawes, Meyerowitz, Gassad, dear members and friends of the Bavarian Amerika-Akademie, and ladies and gentlemen. First, as I just had noted, I really would like to thank State Minister Herrmann for his moving words. And in many points, I wholeheartedly, the United States government wholeheartedly agrees with on our approach to how to deal with terrorism. And also his words that revolve around the survivors and those who had perished. Many survivors find solace in the fact that those who perished are still remembered around the globe. And as President Obama said in his final commemoration of the 9/11 attacks, the best memorial that we can give to those who perished on that day, and the solace to the survivors, is to continue fighting for those beliefs that Americans hold dear, that we stay true to ourselves, true to our ideas and principles, and that we do not let others divide us. So, as it was pointed out, Saturday did mark the 20th anniversary of the event that has left a lasting impression on most, if not all of us. I remember 9/11 quite vividly. As you could say, I was an eyewitness. I actually had just pulled up to the Pentagon on the other side. I had a meeting in the Pentagon that morning, and as I was literally getting out of the bus, which I had taken from my house to the Pentagon, the plane struck the other side of the building. And I will never forget the sound. It sounded like a huge dumpster, a trash container being dropped from 15 stories. It was this reverberation that went through us all on the bus. We had known that the Pentagon, that the World Trade Tower, first one, had been struck, and that is what, having worked at the Rand Corporation, which was across the way from the Pentagon, I was actually working on counterterrorism studies at the time, and when we found out that Al Qaeda had, well, there was an attack on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, and there was an attack on the Pentagon. Al Qaeda had traditionally always operated in twos. Back in '98, when they hit 2 of our embassies in Africa, that was the case, and that was kind of their tell, and so I was thinking Pentagon, but it was an attack, but I thought the attack had actually happened in the Pentagon because I couldn't see the plane hit. But then pieces of the plane started raining down on us. You know, they had such impact, and they had gotten to be very small. And I just remember watching people clear out of the building, running literally for their lives, and then I just made a beeline for the office, which was across the interstate, and just feeling the heat from the fire and from just seeing those horrific sights that were visible on the west side of the Pentagon. You know, President Biden says it doesn't matter if it's the first time, the first year, the 20th, 50th. Never feels different. And it's difficult. And 9/11 attacks claimed the lives of 2,977 victims. Those were on that day. But if we start going forward to 20 years and we think about what has happened in the world, the war on terror and the continued terrorist acts, it could be argued that it goes beyond that. 11 years following that, I lost another friend, Benghazi. So, as you can see, it goes on. And we in the State Department of Defense, our military men and women, unfortunately have paid that ultimate price up until 2 weeks ago. That day in 9/11, 90 countries had lost citizens in the attacks. Colleagues at the United States consulate here in Munich remember the outpouring of disbelief, of grief, of solidarity on that day by the Bavarian population. And the archived letters that we've kept from that day, we put on display last week on Friday, and I had the honor of welcoming Landrat Präsidentin Aigner into the consulate to show her just the outpouring of absolute sympathy, but also real solidarity. And it shows the 7+ decades what the transatlantic relationship means to the Germans, to Bavarians, and to the United States. It was very touching to go through those, from mayors, from politicians, from students, just from regular everyday folks, and just to see that, yeah, we were all Americans that day because a real part of us was attacked. And as Secretary Blinken just said a few days ago, we are inspired by the incredible strength and resilience of survivors and the perseverance of our international partners and of the American people. An important part of honoring victims of terrorism is working to prevent further terrorist attacks. You know, and unlike the devastation that has been wrought by the pandemic, this attack was a deliberate act of brutality and expression of utter contempt for humanity. 2001, we vowed to prosecute the surviving perpetrators and to diminish the threat of future terrorist attacks conceived on Afghan soil. And that's exactly what we have done. Now, while Osama bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders, other terrorist groups have been brought to justice, terrorism and violent extremism, both domestic and international, remain significant threats to our societies. Countries, state actors like Iran, like North Korea, that are state sponsors of terrorism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, continues to be a challenge. Likewise, racially or ethnically motivated terrorism remains a challenge for the global community. Continuing on this journey and making the world a safer, more peaceful place is one of the reasons that I joined the Foreign Service almost 1 year today of the attacks of 2001. We do realize that this 20th anniversary stands out from previous anniversaries as our joint military mission in Afghanistan concluded merely 2 weeks ago. We'd like to thank military and civilian personnel, both from the United States and its allied nations and partners, for their incredible service and dedication over the course of the past two decades. Of course, we all had hoped that it would end a different way and there would be different developments than those that had happened over the past few weeks. However, many of my colleagues deployed to Ramstein in recent days to help with the evacuation efforts, the largest airlift in U.S. history, with the evacuation of more than 120,000 U.S. citizens of our allies and partners, Afghan allies of the United States, those Afghans most at risk, have shown that this is a truly global endeavor, with many countries contributing to the airlift and bringing these Afghan people to a peaceful and a better future. As Secretary Blinken has said, as our Chargé Clark Price has said, this mission is about saving lives, that those folks that have contributed look upon this to every face, every Afghan person that's come through Ramstein or Doha, and that we have actually helped save lives, and that should not be lost in this evacuation effort. Also, President Biden has stated over countless times that we will continue to support the Afghan people through diplomacy and humanitarian assistance, and by all means in our power, we will continue to press for safe passage and respect for human rights. Before I conclude my remarks, I would like to draw your attention to the triptych. I do hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's one of those words that doesn't usually come up in Diplo speak every day. These images show the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, once the tallest building on Earth. In 2000, Bavarian artist Maria Maya spent some time in the Big Apple. Fascinated by the clear form, the geometric shape, and the great complexity of the potential views of the architectural structure, she photographed the towers about a year before the devastating attacks that would bring it down. The result, after almost a year of intensive work and many discarded versions, was the kaleidoscopic, fragmented version of the towers. At the consulate, we were very impressed with this fascinating piece of art. It immortalizes the Twin Towers that stood iconically in the very midst of this vibrant metropolis as a lasting symbol of global cultural collaboration. We've put them on the copy on display for those who would like to stop by Königinstrasse 5. You can see it out in front of our consulate. The One World Trade Center was erected to fill the void that the Twin Towers left behind. Quote, "We remember, we rebuild, we come back stronger." That's what then President Barack Obama inscribed into the beam to be placed on the very top of One World Trade Center, reminding us all that the resilience is one of our greatest strengths. And that's why earlier this year we asked Ms. Meyer to realize her vision of this large-scale rendering of her triptych. Tomorrow, it gets to travel onward to the State Chancellery for State Minister Herman's colleagues and visitors to see. Thank you very much for your attention. I think this should be a very engaging discussion tonight. And thank you, really, for being there with us then and now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Consul General, for your opening remarks. And now we move on to the panel discussion. And when we started planning this event in early summer, we felt that the 20th anniversary, which is what we call in German a round anniversary, ein rundes Jubiläum, was something that we could not let pass without somehow doing something academically. But when we planned this, we had the feeling that 9/11 was somehow receding into history. So many things had happened since 2001, the election of Barack Obama as the first African-American president of the United States, the world financial crisis of 2008 that unleashed a global recession, the populist, the right-wing populist attack on America's democracy, the election of President Donald Trump, the crisis of America's political order, George Floyd, the police killing of George Floyd, the persistence of structural racism, the Black Lives Matter movement that also had far-reaching effects on how we discussed racism in Germany, and not the least COVID-19. So we had the feeling that all of these events were somehow new layers of experience that put a greater and greater mental and temporal distance between us and 9/11, and then all of a sudden the dramatic events in Afghanistan and the victory of the Taliban and the defeat of the West brought 9/11 back to the fore, and brought it back to the fore with a vengeance. So the meaning of this whole event changed within the last couple of weeks significantly. But when we planned this, we were also looking back on our workshop that we did 10 years ago, which was 9/11 10 years after. So we are not really very imaginative about the titles that we give to our events. So the workshop conference 9/11 10 years after actually was a concerted teaching effort where we had 3 seminars, university seminars, taught independently at the universities of Augsburg, Regensburg, and Würzburg. And the idea was to bring these 3 seminars together, invite a couple of keynote speakers whose texts we had read throughout the semester, and then have some sort of a collaborative discussion, a joint effort at trying to come to grips with 9/11. And when we did that 10 years ago, I think 9/11 was still on the top of everybody's minds. We were still grappling with the meaning of 9/11. We had David Simpson here, who had written a book on 9/11 memory, and he had argued that we had been much too rash in assessing the meaning of 9/11, that we should have taken more time to think about what this event actually meant to the Americans, to the world, to the West. We had Jeffrey Melnick here, who had written a book on 9/11 culture, which was seen as an emerging culture where artists, where musicians, where authors were trying to make meaning of 9/11, but there were also first voices who said, well, let's move beyond 9/11. Let's move beyond the war on terror. Let's stop being preoccupied with 9/11. Let's start to historicize 9/11 and get back to normal. So this was somehow what we discussed 10 years ago. And so when we planned this workshop, we had also our workshop 9/11 10 years after in mind. And all of the panelists that are with me here, either in real life as Philip Gassad, or on the YouTube screen, as in the case of Birgit Davis and Joanne Meyer-Rovitz, we were all involved in this. So Philip taught a seminar, I taught a seminar, and Birgit actually wanted to teach a seminar, but then decided to somehow change places. But she was still with us, and she also was involved in the planning of the whole thing. And so it's also very interesting to see how the four of us who were involved in all this 10 years ago see and assess 9/11 with the perspective of 20 years wisdom of hindsight. And this is somehow the overall frame into which we want to move tonight. So how did we see 9/11 in 2001, where everybody was convinced that 9/11 wasn't a world-changing event, that somehow the world was completely different after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon? How did we see it in 2001? How did we see it in 2011? And how do we see it now? And how maybe will future historians assess the role and place of 9/11 when there's even more temporal distance between the actual events and the people who look back on them? So here to discuss with me all these complicated but interesting questions are, in alphabetical order, Birgit Davis, Philip Gassad, and Joanne Meyer-Rovitz. And to start in alphabetical order, Birgit Davis is a professor of American Studies at the University of Flensburg, which is way up in the north, on the border of Denmark, where she has been serving as professor of American Studies since 2015. Her fields of interest, and you can all somehow click on their website, so I will really keep it short to have enough time for discussion. Her fields of interest are Native American literature and culture, transnational American studies, and, surprise, surprise, memory culture with a focus on 9/11 literature, and her expertise really is put into her dissertation, which was on ground zero fiction, history, memory, and the representation in the American 9/11 novel, which came out with the Winter Verlag in Heidelberg in 2011. So Birgit, it's great to see you at least virtually, have you with us here tonight. Next in line is Philip Gassad, who is a professor of contemporary history at the University of Mannheim, where he has been teaching since 2014. And in my way of thinking, he's one of the leading experts on the history of 20th century transatlantic relations and 20th century German history. So the idea of contemporary history, which in German is Zeitgeschichte, is really hard to translate into other academic cultures. But he is a leading expert on the 20th century history of Germany in European perspective, and he has just published a short monograph on the history of 9/11 in German for the general reader with Reklam publishers. So Reklam is, of course, the guarantee that generations of school kids will have to read this book, and it's good to have him look back on 9/11 with a 20 years kind of distance. So Philip, good to have you here in real life in Munich in the newly redecorated Theatersaal. And last but not least, we have Joanne Meyer-Rovitz with us, who is Arthur Junapsky Professor of History and Professor of American Studies at the University of Yale, which she joined in 2004. Her fields of interests do not, first and foremost, let you suggest that she could be interested in 9/11, because her fields of interest is 20th century history in general, with a clear focus on gender and sexuality, and also more recently an interest in global poverty. But in 2003, she edited the volume History and September 11 on behalf of the Organization of American Historians and their Journal of American History. And this, in my way of somehow reading this, was the first attempt to somehow historicize 9/11 at an early stage. So it was 2 years after the events. Joanne edited this volume where historians tried to reflect the meaning and the historical place of 9/11 shortly after the events. In 2011, she was here with us to give a much acclaimed keynote, and I'm glad that she is back with us here tonight. So, hi, Joanne. Good to have you in your home office with us here as well. Good. The overall idea for tonight is that we will have the panelists give short, roughly 5-minute statements on the questions that I just staked out. Then we will go into a round of discussion, or maybe a second round of discussion among ourselves, and then we will open the floor, or the panel and the whole discussion to the audience, and the audience meaning here people present in this room, although I cannot hardly see anybody because all the lights here, but also people watching this on YouTube. Please feel free to ask all kinds of questions relating to 9/11. I mean, you can also ask about life in general, but that's not what we're here for tonight. Good. And as Philip is sitting right next to me, and as he has just written this history of September 11 for a German audience, Philip, how do you somehow assess the meaning and historical place of 9/11 from the perspective of 2021?
Well, thank you, Volker. Before I start with my input, I would like to thank Dr. Margareta Schweiger-Wilhelm for organizing this, for all of us, you and the board of the Academy, for bringing us together, the Minister for his word of greeting, and of course, Consul General Liston, for being here and for sharing your stories with us, which are quite moving. And that brings me to my first point, that I would have wished that I was not the first person to go first, because I find it difficult, actually. I wonder whether it has become even more difficult to talk about 9/11 in such a setting where we sit together as those who have lived through the events, but we also, as scholars, have the job of, explaining how it could happen, that these young men empowered themselves to bring down these two towers and, kill about 3,000 people. I find it difficult because it is not yet history in that sense. It is still present. And as a citizen, as someone who has had a transatlantic career for many years, who has lived in the United States, as a human being in general, I think, that I have to express sympathy and solidarity with the victims, and that's not just that I say I think I have to, but I really, feel with the people. On the other hand, as scholars, we need to address the mistakes that came out of 9/11, and we also need to address why, these terrorist acts happened, and why we had a global situation in the year 2000 that it came to this. So since you asked us to briefly comment on 2001, 2011, and 2021, I'll do that rather quickly. And yes, it was first shock and awe reaching out to American friends and colleagues. I was living in Heidelberg at the time where we had a big American military community. There were candlelight events, there were religious services, many great outpouring of solidarity in that town, and it was like you described it, when we were speaking before the event. Nous tous sommes américains. This was the headline of Le Monde the following day, and it summed it up quite well. We are all Americans, We feel with America. And the tragic of the whole thing is, and this became clear rather quickly, that some Americans, and in that case George W. Bush and his government and followers, wanted to use the chance of the attacks to solidify and even extend the unilateral moment, the so-called unilateral moment, and we can talk about that had happened because of the demise of the Soviet Union. Take out the Taliban first, and then Saddam Hussein in the interest of a new American century. And now, if we look back, and I'm almost talking from today's vantage point, that seems to have been a huge mistake. But the argument was already being made at the time, so I'm not ahistorical here, judging from behind. There was a critical discussion already going on at the time. Now, I was shocked by what I saw and heard when I came to Washington, D.C. 2 weeks after events. I was attending a conference, and even some of my liberal Washingtonian friends were consumed by rage and anger and hubris with regard how the terrorists would be brought to justice. And it was at the time not the question whether the terrorists should be brought to justice, but there was a fear in Germany that this would lead to war. And, you know, because of the way our government reacted right after 9/11, there was a very real chance for that. So that was, in a way, more ambivalent at the time, as we sometimes admit today. On the one side, there is this solidarity with the victims and their families, and on the other side, there was the fear this would lead to unwelcome developments. 10 years later, you mentioned that already, Volker, there was this debate among historians. Joanne contributed to that, and we all contributed to that. There was a big panel at the German historians gathering, the Historikertag in 2012, that brought many arguments together. And, you know, at the time, in 2011, 2012, American hegemony was not yet challenged in the way it is being challenged today. Obama was president, so the transatlantic relationship had markedly improved after he had been elected. But China, even though Obama was pivoting toward Asia, had not received the kind of attention that it is receiving today. It seemed in 2011 that the impact of 9/11, apart from the families and the victims and their families, had been mild, except for those countries who had become engulfed in the war on terror. That was sort of a in-between situation, if I look at it today. From hindsight, Obama had withdrawn the troops from Iraq. It was the moment of the Arab Spring, so in a way one could even think that the democratizing agenda of George W. Bush had created an opening in many Muslim and Arab countries. We all know that the backlash was fierce, with IS, an even more dangerous terror franchise sprang up in Syria and Iraq. But this is not how it was present at the 10th anniversary. That was still in the future at that moment, but it had already become clear that Western values had been damaged in the war on terror. Today, final step. Very clearly, I think America and the West has squandered the unipolar moment. We had that opening. Biden has replaced Trump, and Obama was seen as a liberation. I have said that. And the international standing of the United States has improved again, but I think it is not coming back to where it was pre-9/11. And that is something that concerns all countries and citizens of the Western community, whether they are in the United States or in various European countries and NATO members. And I think we Europeans have also squandered our opportunities. We have not made much progress together when it comes to working together as Europeans with our American friends in promoting human rights, peace, and prosperity in the world. Actually, Europe has become weaker with that regard. So while people are differentiating, if they think they are differentiating between what our governments do and, you know, whether that is in the United States or in Europe, Western democracy as such has suffered from human rights abuses such as those in Abu Ghraib, and that is a symbol of a deeper problem that came up after 9/11 and the wars that sprang from 9/11. So the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and you said, Volker, that we shouldn't really dwell too much on those recent events, but I want to make one particular point. The withdrawal from Afghanistan has reminded us that when it comes to women's and human rights, even the highly corrupt Afghan government, yes, and we were not reining it in, was better than what existed before and after under Taliban rule. But we also have to realize that a huge price had to be paid by the international community for the liberation of upper and middle class Afghan women. So there was a high price that was paid by the Western community, and we know that it didn't extend to all of that country. It was an elite phenomenon. So in sum, if we look back today, not much good came of 9/11. The divisions in American society, I'm sure we'll talk about that, were in existence before 9/11, but the specific path that was taken by the US government deepened existing cleavages between blue and red, between liberals and conservatives. Right-wing populism and isolationism preyed on the frustration that endless wars left behind in American society. So that is one of the results, I think, of 9/11. Final word. How 9/11 is remembered shows that it is still an open wound. It is still an open wound in America. It is a chapter that has not been closed. It is right, that in our memorial services, we remember those who perished and their families and the victims of these terrorist attacks. But it is still too hot an issue to say and to accept that also because of the wars that were fought after 9/11, hundreds and thousands of victims have been produced in other countries that were as innocent, and I'm not talking about the terrorists, of course, that were as innocent as those Americans and the members of the other nations who perished in the towers and who perished at the Pentagon and in that field in Shanksville in Pennsylvania. So it is still an issue that is, as we say, is qualmt, if I say that in German, because I'm missing the English word here. It is still the smoke we can still see the smoke of the events of 9/11, and I think 20 years after, that has become even more obvious than it was 10 years ago. Thank you so far.
Well, Philip, for not wanting to go first, I think this was a very wonderful first contribution. You put a lot on the table. And now it will be interesting to hear Joanne, who was, as I said, involved in an early attempt at historicizing 9/11 in 2003 already. Joanne, how do you see 9/11 from the multiple perspectives that we somehow have been moving on so far?
So thank you, and thank you to everyone at Amerikahaus who organized this event. Thank you for having me again, because as Volker said, a decade ago, I joined you in Munich for the conference on the 10th anniversary of September 11th. And back then, I presented some thoughts on how historians, that's my field, had engaged with the horrendous attacks and their aftermath. So at that time, 10 years ago, and even earlier before that, right after September 11th, a lot of the commentary came in the form of opinion columns in magazines and newspapers. And I found around 100 such opinion columns on September 11th written by historians. And I also found a few scholarly books and articles. And here's what I learned back then. Right after September 11th, historians looked for precedents that resembled the terrorist attacks, the surprise bombing of Pearl Harbor, say, or earlier terrorist attacks, both domestic and foreign, that had targeted civilians. Historians soon moved on, though, to warnings about unnecessary and prolonged and damaging wars, with most frequent reference to the quagmire in Vietnam. There was early on anti-war protest. And then historians turned their attention to the security state with its longer history of surveillance and violations of civil liberties, found, for example, in the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, or in the anti-communist Red Scares of the 1920s and 1950s, or in the long history of racial profiling of Black Americans. So the common years ago was that the events of September 11th did not represent a clean break with the past. It was not a day, as the New York Times had claimed, when history split in two. There were plenty of historical precedents, not only for the terrorist attacks themselves, but also for the resulting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and for the heavy-handed surveillance of immigrants and Muslims within the United States. So now, 10 years later, where are we today? We still don't have many history books or articles on September 11th. Historians tend to wait 25 or 30 years before they write about past events, so I'm glad to hear that Philip is writing now. But it's safe to say that there's ongoing interest in the rise of extremism, in misguided wars, and in intrusive surveillance. And now we're also looking forward from September 11th, finding its legacies as well as its precedents. Today's scholarship, I'd say, tends to put more emphasis in three areas. First, and interestingly, technology. We now see September 11th as accelerating the technologies of terrorism, war, and surveillance. Scholars are paying more attention, for example, to the rise of social media and its use by extremists, to the use of armed drones and other forms of cyber warfare, and to the growth of high-tech data gathering on everyday life. All of these seen as pushed forward by September 11th. Second, no surprise here, there's a new emphasis on Trumpism, with some commentators now positioning September 11th as a precondition of sorts for Trump's rise to power. September 11th reanimated a form of hyper-patriotism and an anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim xenophobia that Trump used to craft his particular variant of conservative politics. You can see this, for example, in a new book that just came out last month, Spencer Ackerman's book, Reign of Terror, which has the subtitle, I've got the book right here, which has the subtitle, How September 11th Destabilized America and Produced Trump. And third, Afghanistan. In just the past few weeks, we've seen a new reckoning with the war on terror. From early on, scholars condemned the misinformation and lies that led to the war in Iraq and worried about the imperialist overtones of an unending occupation of Afghanistan. And now Afghanistan is, of course, as we've all already noted, once again in the headlines, and we're still comparing it to Vietnam. As one historian wrote last month, the war in Afghanistan was, quote, a policy that was doomed from the start, meddling in another civil conflict thousands of miles away. So that's where we are now, with similar themes as before, extremism, war, the security state, but with a more recent emphasis on September 11th's impact on technology, on Trumpism, and on what can only be called a debacle in Afghanistan. So let me turn now really briefly to some of my own current research, which looks at the Federal Victim Compensation Fund, which was enacted just a couple weeks after September 11th. Congress passed the act in order to stop victims' families from suing and bankrupting the airlines, and instead giving them payouts, government payouts. I've been using an online archive of 12,000 emails, which were written to the Department of Justice, which asked for comments, solicited comments on the Victims' Compensation Fund. And the emails show that the process quickly descended into acrimony, and the arguments that emerged highlight some of the less obvious repercussions of September 11th. For example, there was a surge of sentiment seen in the emails in favor of gay rights right after September 11th, and there was a public move away from sympathy for undocumented immigrants. One of the largest debates was over the government payouts themselves, which were based in part on the earnings of those who had died. Hundreds of citizens wrote in wondering why their tax dollars should pay for the private schools and expensive lifestyles of the wealthy, the families of financial executives, for example, who had died. Why, they asked, were the wealthy getting large payouts, which were sometimes in the millions of dollars, when the families of soldiers who died in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the victims of earlier terrorist bombings, or anyone who had died in a tragic event were getting nothing. They wrote scathing emails about government handouts to greedy whiners, and that's the word greedy. Greed was used over and over again. So right in this moment of supposed national unity, right alongside lots of sympathy, deserve sympathy for the victims and the families of victims of September 11th. We find loud debates about the proper role of government and protests of the inequality, which was baked into the law, that made some lives worth more than others. And this too is part of the legacy of September 11th. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne, for this thought-provoking second statement. And last but not least is our own Birgit Davis, whom I can no longer see on my screen here. Is she there? Birgit?
Yes, I'm here. I hope you can see me now.
I can see you on my screen now, too.
Okay, good.
Wonderful. So how do you, as a first and foremost literary scholar, how do you assess the questions, or how do you answer the questions?
Thank you so much. And I also want to thank everyone at Amerikahaus for organizing this event and for putting it together. It's a great honor to be here again. And as you said before, we did this 10 years ago, and it is really interesting to look back another 10 years on. So I want to actually begin with a quote and then try to formulate 3 thesis statements about the way in which, or the ways in which literature has developed over the past 2 decades. And the quote is from a 2020 collection of essays by Iranian-American writer Porokista Kakpour. And she writes, the collection is called Brown Album. And in there, she writes about 2001. And she says, for an entire semester, every story I workshop started out being about something else and ended up being about 9/11. Because what could you do but wedge yourself into the narrative until the story was a story of you and the crime against the self, yourself, to be specific. And yet, when you try to make sense of all the layers of nonfiction, fiction, with its insistence on order, creeps in to tidy the narrative. This is, I think, a very nice summary of what fiction has done in the past 20 years. And my first thesis is that fiction has indeed been one of the major contributing media to reshaping our cultural memory of 9/11. It demonstrates that the events did mark a turning point, and it has also diversified the memory of this turning point in significant ways. In the past 20 years, if we count only US American writers, over 200 novels have been published that can be broadly categorized as what I heuristically termed ground zero fiction 10 years ago. And that is novels in which the focal point is 9/11, or in which the events at least have a very strong impact on the plot or on the characters. And most of these novels were published in the first decade, but in the past 5 years, at least 16 more American novels were published that used the event as a center and as a focus. And I think this is particularly remarkable, considering that in 2010, Pakistani-American poet Anis Shivani already proclaimed the death of the American post-9/11 novel. And this leads me to my second argument, which is about the ways in which literary scholarship has dealt with these texts. One of the prominent claims made by many literary critics has been that the 9/11 novel has failed to adequately transform the memory of the event into something more meaningful for American society at large. And these critics claim that most novels were marked by what Richard Gray termed a retreat into domestic detail, or what Michael Rothberg described as a failure of the imagination. Others have also charged writers with being completely apolitical, with navel-gazing, or with excluding others. And so my thesis is that this has become a fashionable point of view, but it is also wrong. Most of the arguments were made with reference to a largely fixed set of texts, which were perpetuated into some sort of 9/11 canon. And among them are Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, or Jay McInerney's The Good Life, John Updike, Terrorist, or Don DeLillo's Falling Man. And it is interesting that there has also been a kind of counter canon to this, including texts most frequently cited usually Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist, or Joseph O'Neill's Netherland, or Amy Waldman's The Submission. So there are also novels which are apparently more desirable. And we can talk about this in more detail in the discussion, but I believe that this self-fulfilling canon does not do justice to what 9/11 novels have achieved, and they are certainly far from being apolitical. And thirdly, contrary to many critics, I believe that it is the other way around. I think it is precisely through continuity that, rather than through any revolutionary means or through techniques that are particularly spectacular, it is rather through continuity that 9/11 novels help us frame the events more critically. Fiction has not been loud or exceptionalist, but it has quietly done what Ulrich Baer called the unconscious history writing of the world, which means it's a way of registering subtle shifts before they become obvious for everyone. Many novels have drawn larger lines of political responsibility, and they have also set question marks to the official narrative. And they did so without spectacular proclamations of originality. And I think that is one of the defining features of 9/11 novels, especially in the past 10 years. Critics who were expecting the great American 9/11 novel thus had to be disappointed, obviously. But we did get American 9/11 novels in the plural, literally and figuratively in the plural. Novels that contested how the nation was transformed into a homeland, and novels which juxtaposed a war on terror with transnational and trans-ethnic relationships. And I have a lot of examples. Patty Dan's 2003 Sweet and Crazy comes to mind, which was one of the first novels published on the attacks. Poro Kistakakpur's own The Last Illusion from 2014, or more recently, Laila Lalami's The Other Americans from 2019. All of these put things into perspective, and they show relativity and invite empathy. And I think in summary, we can safely say that 9/11 may have receded into the background of American literature, but it is still there, and it is certainly not alone. Thank you.
But let me ask you, Birgit. I mean, I'm this kind of hybrid guy. So I'm a trained historian, but I also teach at a department of American Studies where there are a lot of students who do literary criticism. And well into the 2010s, I had ever so many students who wanted to write their BA thesis or MA thesis on 9/11 themes, 9/11 poetry or 9/11 novels or a drama. But this somehow stopped sometime after 2012-13, so just shortly after our last conference, where I had the feeling now I have all the knowledge and I can really advise them, but now nobody wanted to write about this anymore and write about other things, populism and African-American history, racism, and all of these things. So do you have the feeling that there is still a lot of student interest in 9/11 literature as a specific type or as a certain kind of American literature, or is that something that is also becoming historic? And I'm still thinking about Philip's remark that it's not yet history, it's somehow still smoking a little, it continues to be an open wound, but at the same time it seems to be on its way of becoming history. So what is your experience with the students? And I also would be interested in Joanne's remarks on that. Are students still very much interested in 9/11 proper in the United States?
It is interesting, of course, a very good, interesting question, and it totally depends on what we teach, right? And if you teach 9/11 novels, then of course you also rekindle that interest. But we have to take into account that students today don't have any conscious memory of the events, right? Because they were too young at the time, or they hadn't even been born yet. Especially students who are just starting, at the university right now. And so my experience was over the years when I was teaching novels, and I always picked other novels, the interest was huge. And I think that is still the case. It's a very interesting phenomenon to students, but they also have different angles, and they maybe find it interesting for different reasons, right? As Philip said, it has receded a little to the background, but it still is a marker, I would say. Joanne, what are your thoughts?
So, you know, among my graduate students, I'd say there is not a lot of interest in September 11th per se, but some of the themes that came out of September 11th are of great interest. So the study of extremism, or the study of surveillance, domestic surveillance, the study of anti-immigrant sentiment, the study of wars. And so the kinds of themes that came out of September 11th, even though the event itself seems to be of less interest among my graduate students. Undergraduates, it's a somewhat different story. And you're right, Birgit, that we have, the undergraduates were barely born at the time of September 11th. And just this last semester, I taught a course, contemporary history course, on the first decade of the 21st century. And our first weeks were spent on September 11th. And the students were utterly fascinated. They all knew something about it. They knew it had happened, and they were completely fascinated to read the commission report, or to hear what some historians had said, or to look online and find some of the videos and photographs and poems that were written in the wake of September 11th. So I find that the undergraduates, especially those who are interested in sort of the 21st century and some kind of short history, are completely fascinated with it and want to learn more, because it was something they grew up with but didn't quite know.
And Philip, when you wrote your book, who did you have in mind as readers?
Well, the general audience, teachers, high school teachers. As you mentioned, it's published by Reklam. And so this sort of, you know, defines the field for high school teachers at our schools. I have the same experience, but also because I stopped teaching on classes on 9/11 per se. But when I teach, I'm regularly teaching classes on US international relations, foreign affairs, so on, and people tend to gravitate toward the war on terror. I always want to get them to to write on Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton and the wars in Yugoslavia, and so no, they always want to go post 9/11. That's an observation that I have, and so it's a little bit like Joanne and Birgit was saying. You know, it comes up, but more within context, long-term context, and I think that is a good thing. I'm teaching a class on 9/11, which will actually start tomorrow, and I will now have students, yes, who have no memory. Some of them were born after the events, and when we were doing these classes together 10 years ago, all those students had a first-hand experience, and they all could tell a story how they first learned about the events. Of course, that's no longer the case, and I'm very curious how that changes my teaching and the interaction with the students.
Well, I'm still chewing on this idea, how do we conceptualize 9/11? Wasn't really a break, a caesura that changed the world? Or is it more an event that accelerated or slowed down ongoing processes? I mean, Joanne said that historians are always looking for precedents, and we find them once we look for them. Historians are also very critical of everybody proclaiming a caesura that somehow supposedly changed the world. And we should also be particularly skeptical about people proclaiming caesuras when they want to justify certain policies with it. So I have the feeling that somehow the interpretation of 9/11 as this kind of deep caesura was also the justification for the security state or for the wars in the Middle East. Which is why I, as a historian, are particularly skeptical about everybody running around saying, this and this has changed the world. Or this whole idea about when somehow the first man landed on the moon, everybody said that this was somehow the deepest caesura of the 20th century. With the wisdom of hindsight, I would say that this is one of the most marginal events ever, and we should have looked into the history of computer inventions or something like that. What is your take on that? So how deep was the break? I was asked in a radio interview, what do the divisions of US society have to do with 9/11? And I said, really not very much, because most of these divisions existed before, and they have deepened since. And while 9/11 has played a role, there are other factors that we need to somehow explain the current divisions in U.S. society. So how would you what's your take on that? Is it really, how deep was the caesura 9/11?
I think 10 years ago, the discussion was really the idea of a caesura has helped or has been a pernicious one because it helped a certain political agenda. Looking back at it today, I would say we have a different take on that. And yes, I mean, of course, you are well versed in the theory of history, and you know that a caesura, of course, is an argument about change in history, and a caesura can make manifest what is latent in a society. Yeah, and so as Joanne said, the national security state, it was not started with 9/11, but it got a boost. It's the same we could say about other things. And so it's not the question how deep it was, but how it was interpreted by people at the time, so that certain developments could be set into motion. That would be my answer to how the event, deals with structural things that were exist in the American society or the international order anyway.
And Joanne, what about? I mean, is there a direct path from 9/11 to Donald Trump, or how direct is that path?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's a direct path, but I do think that you can see some of the divisions. You can clearly see some of the things that Donald Trump used to create his version of conservative politics, of right-wing politics. You can see how he picked up on the sort of anti-Muslim sentiment, most explicitly anti-immigrant sentiment, the fear about security, the concern about extremists overseas. He took all of these things and that were brought to sort of a bolder light by September 11th, and he ran with them. And so I'm not sure that we would not have had a Trump without September 11th, but I do think that September 11th, he used September 11th. September 11th helped him. And it created divisions, sort of some deep divisions in American society. Plus, I would say sort of after September 11th, there was a rise of conspiracy theories. And I think that Trump ran with that too, and is still running with that. So I think that that kind of undercurrent of paranoia that leads to conspiracy theories, that was part of it too. But again, none of this is, to me, a clean break with the past. We can certainly find longer histories of paranoia, conspiracy theories, security state, anti-immigrant sentiment, and so on. So it was a push. It was something that opportunists could pick up on and use, but nothing. I don't see it as a sort of epistemic shift, as something that's entirely new here.
And Birgit, are you still with us?
Absolutely. And
yeah.
I'm going to say the same thing about the conspiracy theories, right? I mean, our relationship to truth has unfortunately changed over the past, 5-6 years or so, and that originated there, I think. I mean, we did not have social media in 2001, but we did have the internet, and everyone who didn't have a cell phone on 9/11 certainly went and bought one the next day. We didn't have smartphones yet, but I think there was definitely a shift also in the way that we considered representation of historical events. This was, it was the events were orchestrated in a way that they were broadcast live on television around the world. And I think it's among the three most watched TV events in world history, right? If we don't count sports events. And so our way of dealing with these attacks was very strongly dominated by the way that they were choreographed and the way that they were broadcast. I mean, these images, Miles Orwell called that the destructive sublime, right? These images dominated our memory for the longest time. And they also, I think, prevented a more diversified memory from happening sooner. But the more we saw those images, the more we also diversified them. But yeah, I fully agree. Continuity definitely much rather than rupture.
But I still remember this very weird discussion among you literary critics that somehow 9/11 marked the return of reality and the end of post-structuralism. And I, as a historian, always felt, I mean, reality was never away. And this idea that somehow you needed 9/11 to get a new awareness of somehow the reality in literature or whatever. So how did this discussion go? What's your sense? I mean, this was somehow the deepest break possible, that somehow post-structuralism had somehow said goodbye to reality, and everything was a self-referential textuality, and reality was just text and all of that. And then I remember, was it Alfred Hornung who said, 9/11 marks the return of reality? So how do you see that?
Yes, it was actually Slavoj Žižek, I think, before Alfred Hornung, but certainly other people said it too, you know, obviously, because this event did have that feeling of a reality that came crashing into our lives that had become, you know, playfully postmodernist, if you will. But at the same time, I don't think that came true either, because in the end, post-structuralist techniques in fiction are still around, and they're very successful. Some of the first reactions to 9/11 in literature were very metafictional, very self-reflexive, and tried to experiment with narrative perspectives, narrative situations, and we still have those, right? We still have very playful approaches. I mentioned Porokista Kakpour's The Last Illusion earlier, which is a novel that I would definitely recommend. It's from 2014, and in there, there's a character who's like David Copperfield. He's this magician or this illusionist, and he announces in 2001 that he will make the World Trade Center disappear, and he wants to use rotating mirrors, you know, like Copperfield did with the Statue of Liberty. And then Kakpour plays with this, with the way that this reality, that this magician is envisioning, how this reality actually crashes into and collapses into the actual reality of the day. And so the techniques we're using and the imaginary of 9/11 and the way that we are putting that into fiction and the way we're remembering that is indicating that, you know, it didn't really change anything in that way either.
Okay, is there anything that you wish to, that any of you wants to comment on or come back to regarding what has been said among ourselves here? Any urgent?
No, I think it's
because then we can open the discussion to the audience. And again, if you are present here in the Theatersaal, I ask you to simply raise your hand and then speak from your seat. But you're also welcome to ask questions online through the YouTube channel, and I was told that they will somehow magically appear here on my little iPad. The problem with the audience here is I can hardly see anybody because the lights are really right into my eyes. So, Marga, can you help us out? Are there questions, remarks, or comments from here? Okay, so did the two of you get the question? So first, the lady commented on Hiroshima being a caesura, and that this is somehow some touching moment and of lasting importance because we still fear that somehow atomic powers could use these weapons. But her question was the relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan and how we assess this situation. Philip, as the international relations...
I know there's actually specialists in the room who would know more about that than I, but I want to again come back to the first part of your question, and I want to say, yes, it's not the event as such, you know, that produces the caesura, but it's how we deal with an event and what we make of it. Yeah, that is an important distinction. And here, you know, we are again in the field of interpretation, and not so interpretation by politicians, but by people and so on. Yes, and the way what we do with an event like 9/11 is structured by our culture, by our society, by our ways of talking and thinking beforehand. Hiroshima, if I may, because I have looked at that, is a very interesting example because it was not seen as important at the time as we see it today. It was not until the 60s and 70s that Hiroshima really became that symbolic event, the beginning of the atomic age, you know. That starts around the Cuban Missile Crisis that people start, you know, to talk about Hiroshima. It didn't really concern too many people in the late 40s, in the early 1950s, yeah. Pakistan, yes, I mean the West or the United States, of course, is very closely, or has been historically for a long time, very closely allied with Pakistan, and that goes back to the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan and all of this. But the trouble with Pakistan is, of course, that it also has always been a player inside Afghanistan because of its geopolitical conflict with India, and you know that they have been playing both sides, you know, supporting the Taliban and at the same time. So it's a really very very unhappy, I would say, diplomatically and in the terms of, you know, how the West has structured its policies with Afghanistan, that we were so dependent to some extent on Pakistan, and that has, you know, contributed, I think, to the current situation and the fall, you know, of the government in recent years. So that's, I think, all I can say about it. But that, in particular, is not something that has been really started by 9/11. That situation with Afghanistan and Iran and neighboring countries, that has been going on for quite some time.
And I mean, the first thing that I had to think about when you mentioned Hiroshima is that Jonathan Safran Foer, in his extremely loud, incredibly close, tries to make meaning of 9/11 through the bombing of Dresden and Hiroshima. So this was somehow the attempt to somehow, make me or reflect 9/11 through other bombings. And there we are again with the precedents that Joanne mentioned. Any remarks from your side, either Joanne or Birgit, in relation to Pakistan and Afghanistan? Good, we're all not experts on either Pakistan or Afghanistan here. So there's one question from the YouTube audience. 9/11 is the only case where Article 5 of NATO has been invoked. Huh? But you are not the anonymous here. Or are you using social media by now? Okay. The failure in Afghanistan might suggest that invoking Article 5 weakened NATO. What do you think?
Is it against me? Okay, why don't you answer it, Volker? Well, in the beginning it did not. Because it was seen as a necessary act to invoke Article 5. There was this, you know, unlimited solidarity that Chancellor Schröder expressed. However, as we all know, Fishers, I don't get it, here at the Security Conference in 2002, the story didn't end with Afghanistan, and there was another war coming which divided NATO and the West. And, you know, I don't think we can really talk about these things separate from each other. And so in the long run, yes, it may have weakened NATO, and we are having a hard time organizing our defenses vis-a-vis Russia and other countries who may actually be more threatening than a bunch of terrorists out in the world.
Yeah, but this brings me to the paradoxical moment that 9/11 actually marked. So it was a moment of solidarity. It was a moment of national unity in the United States, as Consul General just mentioned. It was also a moment of somehow unquestioned solidarity in somehow the West. NATO drawing Article 5, the United Nations also condemning 9/11 as an attack on world peace. So it was a moment of unity, it was a moment of solidarity, but at the same time it was also a moment of somehow accelerating Atlantic drift, which brings us back to this whole idea, was it a break or was it a moment that accelerated or slowed down ongoing processes? And so the Atlantic drift had begun pretty shortly after the fall of the wall, I think, and it went through all the administrations ever since Bill Clinton. And so 9/11, again, and this somehow adds to the paradoxical nature of this whole event. On the one hand, a moment of national and international solidarity, but that was somehow also very short-lived because the underlying frictions and the underlying divisions had been there before.
But see, the decisions that were taken in the White House, they are not were not taken because there was transatlantic drift and conflict over Yugoslavia and so on during the 1990s. You know, these were deliberate decisions that were not, you know, uncontroversial. In the American political sphere and population, and you know it squandered the goodwill. I think that's a tragic, if you look at it from a foreign affairs point of view, that's a tragic of 9/11, that the goodwill and the support that had come out of it was really squandered by the Bush government. I can say it differently, you know, even though Bush now has a much better image if we think back at the last inaugural than he used to have in 2002. But that is always the question, what comes after.
Joanne, what's your take on that? Did 9/11 strengthen or weaken NATO and somehow the Western solidarity?
You know, I think what you said about solidarity, what everyone has said about the feelings of solidarity, both within the United States and transatlantic solidarity, and in some places global solidarity, that's true, but it was fragile. It was always fragile. And that solidarity was a sort of rush of sentiment, of feeling, but it was it was short-lived, as you said, and it was so fragile that it almost had to be temporary. And I agree that what the Bush government did, especially in Iraq, just broke it apart almost immediately, that sort of international sense of solidarity, that the lies that were told in order to invade Iraq when Iraq had nothing to do with the terrorist attacks of September 11th. So, you know, yeah, it fell apart quickly. It fell apart quickly, as I think I was suggesting in my own remarks, within the United States as well. So yes, there was that surge of sentiment. And yes, that's still evoked when we come to these anniversaries, when we talk about sort of loss of life, the victims, and the victims not only within the United States, but the victims in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, we have that surge of solidarity, that sort of global humanity, that feeling, but it doesn't erase the underlying fragility of that unity.
Yeah. Birgit, anything from your side?
I fully agree. I mean, the 9/11 did not shatter the solidarity. On the contrary, right? There was a lot of solidarity there. But that came in the aftermath. And I'm not a political scientist, but it's pretty obvious that Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib destroyed the last bit of multilateral trust that was there. And that was certainly a burden in the long run. I agree.
But tell me, I mean, among all, or beneath all this solidarity that was there in 2001 and 2002, I always felt that there was also some sort of an emotions gap between Europe and the United States, because Europeans, although they were shocked, and although they somehow were fully appalled by what had happened, never really somehow were as traumatized as the United States and US society was. I mean, this idea of having been attacked on your own soil, having somehow thrown bombs on your homes and houses, that from some sort of a European experience was, I mean, somehow, in a way, not that somehow deep a caesura as for the Americans it was. And so I always had the feeling that there was this kind of emotions gap, that while we were all somehow shocked by what had happened, European history with all its wars, with the history of terrorism, with all the somehow long history of violence in Europe, were somehow not as emotionally affected by 9/11 as many Americans, traumatized as they were, was. Would you somehow support that or reject that?
I think I would agree with you, and it has to do, of course, with distance. And of course, it was an attack on American soil, and it was not just Americans who perished in the towers, but yes, it was an attack on American soil, and it meant America. Of course, it also meant the West in general and our, values and democracy and freedom. But yes, and that explains why it was a more shocking, more emotional event for most Americans compared to most Europeans. And the same is true, for other events, like the one when we had recent attacks in France or so, there was an outpouring of solidarity as well. Yes, but the French people, of course, felt more about Charlie Hebdo than most of us. So yeah, I think that's an obvious observation to make.
But Birgit is skeptical, obviously.
Yeah, I'm somewhat skeptical about whether it's a question of degree or proximity, really. I'm not sure. I think there was immense solidarity around the world, and especially between Europe and the United States. And maybe that's just my filter bubble, because as an Americanist, obviously I have very close ties to the United States. I have friends there, and so from my personal surroundings back then, I don't think the reaction was any less emotional than it was in the United States. But as I said, I don't necessarily think we can measure this by degree or proximity. Don DeLillo said, I think it was in December 2001, he said, well, those people who were not close will later claim that they were. And those people who did not witness the events firsthand will later probably believe they did. And it feels very much that way, I think. So I'm not sure.
Joanne, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, when I have been talking about September 11th, I talk mostly to the people around me who are in the United States. And it was obviously a tragedy and horrendous in the United States, and a tragedy and horrendous in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I was wondering, when I was coming into this panel, before we even met, when I was invited to join you, I was wondering, how is it understood as part of European or German history? So it's not a tragedy on your soil, but nonetheless, did it have an impact? Do you see it as having an impact on European history or in German history, a longer lasting impact, other than beyond the emotion, the solidarity, the initial solidarity?
Oh, I think it had a huge impact, because not only was NATO Article 5 for the first time invoked, yes, we had some military contribution to the campaign. The last one, the Kosovo campaign, that was the really big breakthrough in 1998 with the red-green government. But yes, it was the first time that the Federal Army and Air Force would go abroad big time. This was a breakthrough with regard to the use of military force as far as Germany is concerned. And yes, there is now many veterans and others, diplomats who were stationed, teachers, at the German school, and NGOs and so on, who were stationed in Afghanistan, and who can, in a way, tell similar stories like their American comrades. And yes, of course, there is German soldiers and civilians who died in Afghanistan. And it is a debate that often reminds me of the one that is being carried out in the United States, that veterans feel that it has been in vain, especially now. That has been a trope in recent discussions with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that their sacrifice is not really appreciated to the extent here in Germany, to the extent they want to have it appreciated. And we know from many movies, novels and other things, and talks by American veterans that there is a similar feeling in the United States. In that sense, it has brought us together. And when we look at the peace movement and the opposition, that also is a transatlantic event. We always have to stress that. Still, I would maintain, I would be with Volker, that the emotional quality has been somewhat different, and maybe that has to do with our general culture. And I have seen people in Germany at the time who were actually saying, and this did not, you know, it was, I would say it was within a white majority German community. Some people were saying, yes, now finally the Americans have also, you know, met some justice, and that's because of their imperialism, and you know the argument. And that sentiment was there in Germany. It was not publicly voiced by our politicians, but it was there, despite the huge outpouring of solidarity, which was genuine in Germany as well, and the Consul General, you know, has mentioned that in the beginning. It's not a lie, you know, but there was this other side, very, you know, in chat rooms and so expressed, internet chat rooms expressed.
Well, I mean, this has something also to do with the history of anxieties and maybe the culture of fear and anxiety, and this brings me to the question that was raised by one of the YouTubers here, and I find this very interesting. In how far has how we memorized 9/11 changed how we approach terrorism as society today? Did it change the way we think about terrorism and the reasons behind it? And I find this, because I think this is really a wonderful question. Maybe to close this whole thing, because we are beginning to run out of time, although if there are questions from the audience, I will be happy to accept them. But let's think about this a bit more, how we memorize 9/11 and how we approach terrorism as a society today. And I remember this wonderful article in your September 11, Joanne, about the Middle Eastern terrorist emerging as an enemy image right somehow, almost September 12, right? So this idea of somehow this Arab-looking candy man distributing poisoned candy to American kids, the Middle Eastern terrorist going back to the Olympic Games here in Munich. So what are your thoughts on that? What's the relation between memorizing 9/11 and thinking about terrorism?
Well, I think there clearly was, from September 11th, an understanding that terrorism, or a sort of fear that terrorism was coming from the Middle East or from Muslims. And so that was seen in the surveillance that took place within the United States and the sort of fears around the border and who was entering the United States. So yes, but I would say in the long run, there has been a way in which September 11th changed how we remember or memorialize terrorism more generally, and that most recently that has shifted to what's now called domestic terrorism, which is right-wing terrorism from within the United States. And that that has been a sort of larger issue in the past few years, and obviously since the January 6th insurrection or since the Charlottesville March and so on. So it was there, of course, before September 11th, but it wasn't always noted as terrorism. So even in the Oklahoma City bombing, something that was a terrorist act was somebody who was associated with other people who had sort of those same right-wing white supremacist views. It was understood as a lone wolf act. And so that the domestic terrorists were often understood as sort of lone wolf, mentally unstable actors. And that has shifted, and in part because of the rethinking of what terrorism is with September 11th, and then with subsequent issues, then with subsequent domestic acts of insurrection and terrorism within the United States from the white ring, from white supremacists. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is a rethinking. Is there a different sort of remembering, I think even a different remembering. I think of sort of Kathleen Ballou's book on the rise of white supremacist militias within the United States that came before September 11th, but she was only interested in it after September 11th. That's what inspired her to do her research and look at this book and redefine some of what we might not have before labeled terrorism as terrorism.
I mean, this is exactly what George W. Bush did in his speech 2 days ago, right? Where he somehow...
Exactly.
Birgit, you look excited.
Yeah, I just think that's a really intriguing thought. And I remember, I guess, the Germans among us in our generation shared that when our first experience with terrorists was, when we were little, there were these posters, these wanted posters in post offices and in, banks and so on, that showed images, that showed the faces of terrorists, and the most wanted people in Germany were these left-wing RAF, terrorists, and that changed probably in 9/11, how we perceived of terrorists as coming from somewhere else, and then the religious terror, the religious background that was specifically Islamist. So that changed, but at the same time, I also agree with you, Joanne, because Derrida said after 9/11 that it was an autoimmunitary response, and he was attacked left and right, of course, for this this expression. And what he meant was it's basically a process that comes from the inside. This was homemade in a way because of the foreign policy of the United States in the 1990s and so on. And if we see recent popular culture, then from TV shows that are hugely successful, such as Homeland or Designated Survivor or The Americans, we see this this tendency of the domestic threat coming in, and I think that Derrida may have had a point there, even though it was very provocative to say it then. But I fully agree.
But I think, there was a lot of talk about terrorism, but there was little conceptual work as to what terrorism actually was supposed to mean. So it was really underdefined and yet omnipresent in everything after 9/11. And that is somehow what I always thought. If you're talking about terrorists all the time, you should really define what terrorism means and how you want to understand it, and then somehow think about how to fight it.
It's an important distinction, because George W. Bush actually declared a war on terror, whereas Ronald Reagan had fought a war. He also talked of a war against international terrorism. And talking of continuity and change, I think it was a much more ambitious agenda that came after 9/11, because it, included national security at home and all kinds of things. So terror should be eradicated not only in the form of the terrorists there, but also of all these domestic threats. So yeah, here we can see something, where there is, of course, a certain tradition of dealing with terrorists since the 1970s. But then, the opportunity presents itself to turn it into a much larger and much more ambitious program. And yes, Joanne is right. Technology, of course, was very important in that context as well.
And in this context, we could also remember Anthony Lake, who in his From Containment to Enlargement, in his attempt to somehow justify a continued internationalist stance in American foreign policy, identified terrorism in 1993 already as one of the future threats that the US would have to face. So also here we are somehow again with continuities instead of breaks. Are there any other questions in the audience? Yes, please. I can see you. Good. Could you stand up and speak up? Speak up.
So my question pertains some events that happened in the aftermath of 9/11, basically related to mass surveillance. So basically, after the events happened, the war on terror was declared, like you mentioned, and basically internet, phones, and wide service providers were being used as a preventive measure to deter
So the gentleman wants to know what we think about the loss of civil liberties in the wake of 9/11. So it's not so much about 9/11 as such, but rather what came of it. And I think this is what we have already started to discuss, and there were some remarks in this direction, but maybe we can pull things together. Joanne, why don't you give it a go?
Yeah, I think that there's a sort of a huge, huge emerging literature now on the loss of civil liberties after 9/11, especially just the sort of increase in surveillance, the increase in policing, the increase in the sort of the security at the borders, but also just the sort of wiretapping that went on, the kind of policing that went on, the kind of profiling that went on. So I think there has emerged immediately after September 11th a great concern about a sort of reanimated security state, something that had been there before, but that had been reanimated and boosted by all sorts of new technology, especially the sort of the technology, the sort of facial recognition and biometric kind of technology that has taken off, that has become ubiquitous since September 11th, and in part because of September 11th.
Any? Okay.
There was a young lady there in the back who wanted.
Consul, is that a raised hand?
It's a pensive thought.
Okay. Well, why don't you share your pensive thought with us?
There's a lot. There's a lot. First of all, I wanted to say this entire discussion has been extremely fascinating. I'm not a historian, I'm a diplomat, but have practiced diplomacy throughout this time. And there have been a lot of valid questions and thoughts and opinions raised. I thought it was very interesting, the discussion of transatlantic drift, the proximity and based on the visceral reaction or the emotional reaction of people, were they strong fear? Was there historical memory coming in? Again, I'm not a historian, but what I can talk about on that issue and the transatlantic relationship is the fact that we built up our capital here in Europe and our principles, they're similar to gemeinsame Werte, as you would say in German, based on 7 years of these kinds of discussions, these academic exchanges, these diplomatic exchanges, having soldiers stationed here, protecting the NATO countries from invasion and from war. All that has contributed to the transatlantic being and thought and unity, which was all then based also on civil liberties, on rule of law, on democracy. Everything that we had set up was exploited and leveraged by the terrorists that we all experienced. I mean, down to the box cutters. If you look what the terrorists carried on board that day, it was literally box cutters. And they were allowed. That was completely fine. Why? Because the system that had been set up by law gave a lot of associations, gave people the right to talk about this, and this was okay. They knew this. So they went and punched holes or used every hole that existed in our open and transparent society, took advantage of it, and at the end of the day, almost 3,000 people were dead. Most amount of people we lost on the United States continent since
right?
Well, thank you very much for getting involved and sharing your thoughts. And I'm very sorry for the two of you because this was much too complex and too complicated for me to summarize in 25 words or less. Sorry about that, but I think this was a good way of starting to end this whole debate, because what I continue to be fascinated by is the perspectivalism of all history. That history is a matter of perspectives. It is a matter of the perspective of the contemporaries who experience certain events. It is the perspective of scholars, and it becomes really problematic when the scholars are contemporaries and start to deal with what they experienced from an academic or scholarly perspective. Sometimes teaching kids who weren't even born when we discuss this thing, when these things that we discuss in our lectures happened. One of my seminal moments in all of teaching was when I started teaching a history of the United States since 1975 and constantly addressing my student audience with, "Do you remember how we did this?" And they all just looked at me as if it was kind of crazy, because for them it was all book learning. And so it is not just the perspective of the contemporaries who experience things and the perspective of scholars and historians. It is also that these historians get older in the course of time and start to see things differently. And so this is what I found most interesting about today's discussion, that we somehow try to somehow relate how we felt in 2009, how we thought about it in 2011, and how we somehow look at things now. And I think this was a wonderful intellectual and educational experience. I'd like to thank all three panelists. So thank you very much, Philip, Joanne, and Birgit. It was really wonderful to do this. It would have been even better had we done this in real life here in Munich. But maybe when we do 9/11 30 years after, we will get together here in real life in Munich. Thank you very much for listening.
We might even have an Oktoberfest by then again.
Yeah. So those who watched us on YouTube, thanks for being with us. To the audience here, thanks for listening to us and asking questions. And so have a good evening, stay healthy, and see you in 10 years.
Okay.